My feelings towards this book are almost as toxic as Violet and Xaden's relationship in it. Almost. Entertained and disappointed all at once, wanting more yet less all at the same time. The duality of man, am I right? I just finished the popular Fourth Wing sequel, Iron Flame, and I definitely have some thoughts about it. I went into Fourth Wing earlier this month completely blind, not knowing anything, and I actually walked away from that book giving it a rounded up 4 stars. It was fun, I liked the magic system, I liked the dragons, and overall, I was entertained. If you're interested to hear more about my thoughts about Fourth Wing, I've linked my video on that down below. I was late to the Fourth Wing train, but the sequel, Iron Flame, actually came out November 7th, so I was excited to read this book and be able to talk about it with everyone else who's currently reading it. Before I get into my Iron Flame review, I just want to give a spoiler disclaimer. So this review is going to spoil the first book. That's the nature of it being a sequel. I will give a spoiler-free version of my review of this book specifically, and then I'll give you a heads up when I'm about to dive into a more spoilered discussion and end my thoughts. So let's get right into it. I read Iron Flame in a couple of days. It picks up shortly after where Fourth Wing left off. So a freshly healed Violet is now navigating this world post the Battle of Resin, where her friend Liam is dead, but her brother is actually not dead. She finds out that her brother has been alive and supporting the revolution, which is actually being spearheaded by Xaden himself. She's also grappling with this reality that the antagonists of the story are actually these dark wielders, figuring out the best way to fight them. This book also expands on Violet and Xaden's relationship with elements of a sort of miscommunication trope throughout it and more spice than the first book. My feelings about this book are mixed. I was indeed still entertained, but I also found myself more generally disappointed than I was with the first book. And I think that has to do with some of the choices that may be specific to me. I do think this book suffers a bit from second book syndrome, and it kind of gave off more like first or second draft vibes than an actual polished story. And I think that makes sense because I've heard that this book was basically turned around in less than a year, which is wild when you think about it. I just thought the plot had, again, like the first book, some inconsistencies, and the character development itself lacked more this time around than the first one for me. While the parts that I liked about the first book were still there, to include the magic system, the dragons, Xaden, I found Violet and Xaden's relationship dynamic more lacking in this book, and I'll actually get more into this in the spoiler section of this review. Overall, I gave this book 3 stars. It's at this point where I feel like the third book could make or break the rest of the series for me. I think I've heard that there's going to be 5 books total, but if the third book ends up being another kind of subpar, mid type of read for me, it's going to be harder for me to want to read the entire thing. That being said, I'm a bit of a completionist, so maybe it'll turn into a hate read. I just don't know at this point. So now I want to move into a more detailed conversation about the book. I'm going to start off with what frustrated me the absolute most with this book specifically, but this means that I will be talking about spoilers. It's also a bit of a rant. I'm coming more from a place of, I liked the first book, I still kind of like what's going on here, there's just some parts of it that I just want to rant about it. So if that's not your cup of tea, this is your warning, cut out now. The most frustrating thing about this book for me was Xaden and Violet's relationship dynamic. I loved book 1 Xaden, and while I felt like Violet has kind of been teetering this edge of being a bit of a Mary Sue type character, I have found her compelling enough to sort of look past this. In this book, however, I just found Violet to be whiny, and her arguments for why she couldn't trust Xaden just did not make sense for me. I don't know how much of it is just me on a personal level, not loving the whole 2 characters that can't communicate like adults trope. I find that trope in general to be frustrating. I liked the push and pull tension of the first book, and it seemed like Rebecca Yarros tried to kind of recreate that tension in this book, but kind of replacing that enemies to lovers with they just can't get on the same page. It just didn't work for me. Violet and Xaden just refused to empathize with each other at every turn, and it felt like they were having the same argument over and over again, neither of them taking responsibility, and it just kind of got tiring. Violet especially just seemed kind of hypocritical, holding Xaden to a higher standard than she was holding herself when it came to her and her being forthcoming with information with her friends, to include with her best friend Rhiannon, who, by the way, she is the most unproblematic queen of all and we must protect her at all costs. Violet would say multiple times that she understands the stakes, she understands the nature of war, and that Xaden is the leader of the frickin' revolution, so, you know, maybe he's not going to be able to tell her everything, but then, like, at the same time flip around and be like, okay, but he won't tell me everything. As much as this is a fantasy novel, it's still very much a romance, and a romance is contingent and elevated by whether or not the romance in the book is successful, and it just wasn't as successful as I wanted it to be for me. I found them to be more cringe this go around, and don't get me wrong, they were cringe the first book too, but in this book they were like making out in front of people, and it would make me laugh imagining them having these like full-blown mind conversations with each other, and sometimes arguments while everyone else is just kind of like staring at them in awkward silence. Like, their relationship was even commented on multiple times by different high-ranking officials, including General Melgren, who was like, well, who hasn't heard about you two, am I right? Eyebrow waggle. And it's just hilarious to me that even amongst the constant killing, death, and impending doom, that these high-ranking officials are just like curious about the tea and the little relationships between 21-year-olds. Like, Violet also had the audacity during the interrogation portion of their class to be like, oh, hey everyone, my personal secret is that I'm in love with Xaden. Okay, first of all, you're telling me you're a former scribe and you don't actually know what the definition of a secret is? You're telling me that the same girl that's been like, but Xaden, all the secrets you've been keeping doesn't actually know what a secret is? Like, no, that's not a secret. Literally, everyone knows. Which leads me to a smaller gripe, but still problematic enough for me to want to bring it up now. And I just did not approve of Violet withholding I love you from Xaden as a condition of his honesty or lack thereof. It just felt manipulative to me, just kind of icky. I just don't approve. Speaking of small gripes, I hate the jealous ex trope. And sometimes it's okay, but when the characters are already in this established relationship, especially when Xaden hasn't been ambiguous about his feelings for Violet, I just don't like it. I don't think that anyone needs to be fighting over a man, even if it's a hot book boyfriend material man like Xaden. I just don't think it's necessary. Especially when the other woman is clearly a badass and beautiful, and I just don't think her worth needs to be contingent on like whether or not she's with a man. I also don't think that his love for Violet needs to be validated by a lack of love for someone else. And I'm also suspect of any guy who speaks poorly of his ex, and Xaden literally says, I don't care if she lives or dies, and I'm just kind of like, okay, that's weird. Is that supposed to be romantic? Y'all don't think that's a green flag, do you? But you know, that might be about my specific preferences and my worldview. Maybe you love that, and that's cool for you. Besides the relationship, there were some distracting plot holes and inconsistencies. There were a lot more battle scenes in this book, which I generally liked, but I realized in reading them that Basgiath had never focused on how to fight as a squad on their dragons or squad maneuvers, and you would think that would be more important than like surviving an interrogation or land navigation. Instead, like, they were just literally discussing their battle plan in the middle of the battle on top of their dragons with enemies all around, apparently. Like, it just didn't make sense to me. The school has put so much emphasis on the squad and squad relationships and, you know, all of that, and you would just think that would include tactical formations as a squad. No? Just me? Make it make sense. So speaking of the squad, something that I will say as a positive is the squad was still a hit for me. Overall, I loved the found family. Even though those characters are still kind of one-dimensional, I still loved the dragons. I liked seeing life outside the wards and learning more about the political structure. The last thing that I want to talk about with this book is the ending. We were left with a pretty big cliffhanger where Xaden, during that final battle, in fear of actually losing Violet, he ends up calling for those darker powers and turns Venom. And suddenly, it felt like I was teleporting back into 2008 and reading a vampire novel, specifically Vampire Academy, and I actually don't hate the similarity, and it intrigues me enough where I'm wanting to see what happens next? Like, is the next book going to focus around finding a cure? I mean, listen, this is why I said my feelings are mixed. I know this review got a little bit ranty, but honestly, it was just nice to be able to speak out loud kind of some of the thoughts that I had while reading this. And like I said, I'm looking forward to picking up the next book, don't get me wrong. Like any good toxic relationship, I still want more. I'm intrigued. I want to know what happens next, and I'm really hoping that the third book just kind of brings it back for me and allows me to sort of invest my time in the rest of the series. That's where I'm at right now. Those are my thoughts on Iron Flame. If you've made it this far, thank you, and see you next time.